Welcome to this week's episode of the Pain Science Education Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Joe Tatta. This week, we are speaking with Professor Cormac Ryan about how to deliver pain science education to the community. Professor Cormac Ryan is a physiotherapist and also holds a PhD. He, of course, teaches in physiotherapy programs in the UK. But what's interesting about some of his work is he's taken pain science education and is now delivering it to the community. So he has set up community lectures where he is training or educating community members about what pain is, what chronic pain is, and how, of course, it can be treated. So learning, right? We're always talking, when we're talking about pain science education, essentially we're talking about learning. How can we help people learn and understand what pain is so that they can better manage their pain and, of course, eventually alleviate it? He did write a really excellent paper, which kind of is the foundation of today's episode. And that paper is called "We Are All in This Together: Whole of Community Pain Science Education Campaigns to Promote Better Management of Persistent Pain." If you'd like to read that article after you listen to this episode, you can find that in the October 2023 edition of the Journal of Pain. This episode is packed full of information, whether you are someone who is living with chronic pain or whether you are a practitioner who treats chronic pain. What's interesting is you can find some of this information online, so you can see what Cormac has actually put online. He has a website, which is called Flipping Pain. It's available in the UK and, of course, available globally. But it's a really nice evolution of the pain revolution, which started in Australia, that has now moved to the UK. And you can see how that has kind of taken root there and what Professor Ryan has done with that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Cormac Ryan. Sit back, make sure you have a pen and paper to take some notes, or if you're listening in the car, maybe pull over for a little while and kind of dial into some really excellent pain science education today on the podcast. All right, let's begin. Hi, Cormac. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
It's great to see you again. We probably spoke probably about 3 years ago. You and I were talking before we hit the record button here. You were on the show 3 years ago. We were talking about the reconceptualization of pain, how some people fully reconceptualize pain. There are some people in the middle that are partial, and then some people that we want to obviously help and support and to move. That, podcast, I would say that episode really focused on how we can impact the individual, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It was very, I guess, clinic focused, one-to-one type contact.
Right. Today, we're going to take it to a much, much broader, yet very impactful level and talk about how we can deliver effective pain science education really to the public. So looking at this from a health promotion perspective, I'm just curious because obviously it's been a couple of years since we spoke. What's transitioned with you that you've taken this focus from kind of the individual and the clinic over to more the population health level?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joe. I think a bit of serendipity. A friend of mine, a chap called Richard Pell, who works for Connect Health here in the UK. They're a private provider of healthcare to the NHS here in the UK. And they were thinking about setting up some form of public health based approach or initiative for different regions throughout the UK where they were working. And they were aware of what I was doing in terms of the pain science education space and research. And they wondered if it's something that I might be interested in working with them on and being involved in and potentially sort of delivering the content within the public health space. So we got the talking, and that's what we decided to do. That evolved, I guess, into the Flippin' Pain campaign, which is a public health campaign here in the UK, which is heavily drawn from the Pain Revolution campaign based in Australia, which is led by Professor Lorimer Moseley. And Lorimer indeed was part of the Flippin' Pain campaign at the embryonic stages, and still is involved, still helps us, extremely generous with his time and support and materials. And since that started, I guess I've kind of had a bit of a road to Damascus change in terms of my own views. I had never really considered the public health approach with respect to pain. But when you think about it, it makes a great deal of sense. If you think about most long-term conditions, if we think about something like heart disease, for example, sure, you've got your clinical component where the patient sees the healthcare professional, they talk about what you should be doing. They might see different multidisciplinary team healthcare professionals, which talk about elements of what they should be doing. But they've also got huge public health initiatives running alongside it. Be active, keep for a healthy heart, eat lots of fruit and veg to keep your heart healthy. All of these huge initiatives that people see on TV, they see on billboards, they see in their everyday life, which encourages them to think and behave in ways that might lead to a healthier heart. And um, there's no reason why we can't be applying, or no reason why we should not be applying a similar approach to persistent pain. One of the biggest challenges in terms of long-term conditions globally. What if we applied that same sort of approach that somewhere, as I say, like cardiac rehab are doing, that takes both a public health and a clinical approach? I think we can do enormous good in doing that, especially from the low bar we're starting at. If you think about diminishing returns, if you're spending billions on clinical care, but you're not, if you spend another billion or two on clinical care, it's probably not going to make a big pile of difference. But if you shift that focus a little and spread the money out a bit, so as you spend where you're spending literally zero on public health for pain, if you shifted that up to spending millions, billions, even small, relatively small sums, I think you could have quite a lot of bang for your buck and make some of the biggest impact. So I guess these past 4 years, 5 years, they've really changed my focus to seeing the potential, the additive potential of taking that more public health approach to pain. It's something that's not being done. I think there's plenty of evidence to show that it has potential. So yeah, that's what's changed. A bit of serendipity just came my way. I jumped on that bandwagon, and I've been really impressed with just how much potential there is.
I love this point you're making right at the top of the podcast, that as physical therapists, or physiotherapists, as you call them in the UK, we have a very important role to promote health and well-being in the community, in the public,
Mm.
and especially with regard to pain recovery in essence.
Absolutely. And there's a public health initiative here, which is a more generalized one called Make Every Contact Count. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. Whenever you make contact with patients or the public, what can you do to help them to take care of themselves better? And when it comes to pain, there's so many misconceptions out there, so many misunderstandings around pain, which draw people towards a more sort of antiquated, out of date approach in terms of pain management. Towards a more interventionist approach towards things like scans, opioids, surgical interventions, all of which surgeries are not surgeries, but guidelines are trying to push us away from. And if we can, with all our contacts, keep sort of nudging people in the right direction, keep just drip feeding the right information over time, I think we can have a huge impact on a societal level to move people towards more active physical and psychological therapies, which is where the guidelines are pushing us.
Yeah, very well said. We're going to talk about the campaigns, both the Australian one, I believe, and the one that you're leading in the UK. Before we do that, I just want to, really help our listeners around two topics, I think. And the first one are misconceptions about pain. Maybe you can just mention maybe one or two of those misconceptions that are most common. and why it's important that we talk about these misconceptions on a broader public level.
Okay, I mean there are lots and lots of misconceptions. I think the idea that pain only occurs when you're injured is one. I think the idea that the greater the level of pain, the greater the level of tissue injury, I think is two. And then the idea that if pain hasn't gone away after a long period of time, it's because the injury that was there has not healed. I think these are three key misconceptions for me. And the reason why they're misconceptions that are important, and going back to kind of what I previously said, is I think they all point towards a biomedical understanding of pain. And that understanding influences the care we seek for it
Mm.
and the manner in which we go about managing it. I think if people have a very biomedical understanding, they will naturally gravitate towards biomedical based interventions, which for the most part, the evidence doesn't support. And in some cases, they can actually be iatrogenic. So, some really,
Harmful for
yeah,
people.
absolutely, absolutely. So, some lovely data from Webster talking about the negative impact of early scanning for people with musculoskeletal conditions, where they don't necessarily have any red flags or any clear rationale for a scan, but they are still sent for one, and how that can lead to, in the long term, greater levels of disability, greater levels of healthcare utilization, and ultimately poorer outcomes by over medicalizing this biopsychosocial condition. Similarly, if we look at opioids, it's if you have a biomedical understanding of pain and how it works, it's not unreasonable to think, well, opioids are something that I should pursue and use. As who wouldn't, if they're painkillers? Surely this is a sensible thing to do. However, as we both know, opioids for persistent pain are, broadly speaking, a bad idea. They come with lots of associated side effects, and the evidence that they are beneficial is pretty limited. And on top of that, there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that they can have a pain enhancing effect over time, which I always find is a real kick in the teeth. You take these things and you bear the brunt of the associated side effects because you feel that you do anything to try and reduce the pain, and then perhaps unknown to you, they're actually just making your system more sensitive. So I think these misconceptions, they chaperone people towards more inappropriate use of medicalized interventions that the evidences don't do, and they shoo people or move people away from the interventions that seem to be the most evidence based. As again, Lorimer Moseley, the term he often uses under a sort of a biomedical approach, our best interventions don't seem to make any sense. They Why, for example, would you embrace something like mindfulness or meditation if your firm belief is that the cause of your back pain is your disc degeneration? It just doesn't make any sense. Whereas if you become if those misconceptions are addressed, if you can begin to look at pain through a different lens, through a biopsychosocial lens, and appreciate that lots of things can influence it, especially your thoughts, your feelings, and your mood. Well, then suddenly you might think to yourself, well, actually, I can see how mindfulness might well be beneficial. I'm open to giving it a go, and often that's the first step on a really important journey.
Yeah, and these are good points because clinicians often ask me, I know you use mindfulness, I know you use an ACT approach in care, but I have a hard time convincing, shall we say, my patients that they should do this or start this. And I say to, oftentimes I say, well, if you go to my website, the first thing you see on my website is a brain. There's no pictures of joints. There's no pictures even of people like running and being active. Not that that is necessarily a bad thing, because of course it's not. But the point you're making here with these misconceptions is that we're moving people away from the thought that pain is a problem with something structural in their body
Mhm,
versus the problem they're having is how pain is processed in the brain. And those are important points to make for
mhm,
everyone. The second
mhm.
question before we go further is these public campaigns are needed because pain is actually on the rise. There's some statistics that support that. Can you explain to us what are some of the factors that is causing the incidence of pain to rise for people? I know there's not just one necessarily, but when we look at pain in the broader umbrella of health and wellness,
Yeah,
there are some factors there that do impact it.
absolutely. I think we live in a painogenic society. I don't know if you're familiar with a colleague of mine called Mark Johnson. He's based in Leeds here in the UK, and that's a term he used. I'm not suggesting that he's the one who coined it or that he's the only one that uses it, but it's one he refers to a lot in his writings, and I think it's a really good point. A lot of the things which we know influences pain in a negative way are things that are sort of actively encouraged and facilitated by the world around us. Um, if you look at sort of the constant change in modern technology and how there's less need to be active to do so many of our jobs, physical activity is such an important part of of pain management. And whilst it's it's not it's very difficult to demonstrate a causative role of physical activity for developing pain. I think there's a reasonable body of evidence to show an association there that being physically inactive puts you at increased risk of developing. And there's much more substantial evidence to show that physical activity, if you have got pain, is a really beneficial intervention to help manage it and to help reduce associated disability, etc. So but the opportunities to do those things are less in the society we're in today. If we compare to even 30 years ago, then you've got media plays a role as well. And whilst there are some media outlets which are super good, such as yourself. You're peddling best evidence and trying to reach as many people as you can. But just like flipping pain is doing the exact same thing. But we are dwarfed by sort of the messages that are much more common within mainstream media about sort of biomedical approaches, etc. I think they are the norm, and they are for every one sort of group in within the media pushing a biopsychosocial view. I think there's easily 99 pushing a more biomedical view, and I think that constant push of a biomedical view creates a society that's set up for biomedical based interventions and approaches. And the reality is chronic pain just doesn't fit into that box. I don't want to be disparaging about the biomedical approach. The biomedical approach has served us really well in lots and lots of situations. One only has to look at long COVID and how important the vaccine was in facilitating better management of long COVID. Sorry, not of long COVID, but of the pandemic. But for persistent pain, it's just a really bad fit. And that constant messaging and the fact that it's really hard to get away from that messaging with everyone's on their phone, everyone's on their sort of computers, etc., it's hard to avoid that constant drip feeding of messaging. So again, I think that makes it hard and sort of facilitates this painogenic approach. But you could take your pick. You know, it's the same point for the food we eat.
Okay.
It's the same point for sort of mental health and well-being. We just have a society, I guess, that all the things we shouldn't do are easy to do and perhaps fun to do, and they just facilitate this painogenic society, and thus it's not surprising, perhaps, that we continue to see chronic pain levels go up or at least remain very, very high.
Well said. And I think you're aware that this podcast primarily broadcasts from the United States of America.
Mhm.
And here we have rather large pharmaceutical companies that, you know, when you're watching when you're watching television from the United States of America in the evening, from the time of 6 p.m. to probably 11 p.m., we have a certain message, and it's around pharmaceutical medication. And I've been podcasting for years, and I tell both professionals and the public all the time that there may be a place for medication in your recovery. However, those are not long-term solutions for the type of sustained relief and activity you're looking to get back to. So I appreciate you bringing those things up. The other thing with, with regard to messages, because oftentimes when we're talking about these public health campaigns and messages, where, most of these are geared toward the public, so to speak, but also as professionals, we have to be aware that subliminally, on some level, unconsciously, these messages may be influencing our behavior too, as a physical therapist or a physician or a mental health provider. And we should be aware of that when we're working with patients or even developing campaigns such as your own.
There's no doubt about that. I think any public health campaign, if it doesn't highlight healthcare professionals as a key target group, it's really, really missing a trick. There's plenty of evidence to show that healthcare professionals have, many of them have just as biomedical a view or understanding of persistent pain as the general public, and maybe even more so. And the issue is that, of course, that healthcare professional sees many, many patients in a day. And so, like, negative ripples in a pond just seems to compound the issue. Whereas if we can produce better education, more informed healthcare professionals, we can have that reverse effect. We can begin to reach more people with these positive messages. I think there's lots and lots of really nice studies which talk about this. The one I always come back to is a lovely study by Bishop and Foster in 2008, where they surveyed in the UK 2,000 physical therapists and 2,000 GPs, and they also sent out it so that what they sent out in the survey, they asked them to rate their how they view pain. So they put it into a biomedical view or a biopsychosocial view. I think they use the HC pairs to classify that. And then they also sent out a patient vignette and asked some simple questions about how you would manage this patient. And it was really clear that those who had a more biomedical understanding were far more likely to recommend taking a passive approach to pain management, bed rest, avoiding physical activity, etc. All the things the guidelines say don't do. And in contrast, those with a more biopsychosocial view were more likely to say stay active, avoid bed rest, try and do your usual daily activities, all the things that are just good practice to recommend. So there's no doubt that there are healthcare professionals out there who have a more biomedical view than they should, and if we can address their misconceptions, I think that's where you get the most bang for your buck. That's where we can see the greatest level of change, I would say. So campaigns such as ours, which are small and not, not funded to the same degree as many other sort of swish campaigns might be, you need to really look for where can you get the most value for money. And I would say that you've put the nail on the head there in terms of where the most value for money would be, probably targeting healthcare professionals.
Excellent. That's a great point for people to take away as they listen to this episode. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experience with flipping pain. And yeah, as I was reading your paper, which I mentioned to the introduction of today's episode, I think you did a really good job in the paper at starting to talk about the importance of pain education, or what my team is starting to call pain literacy in some way, right?
Mm,
Raising people's health literacy around the topic of chronic pain. But there's also a behavior change component to this that's happening potentially at the same time, or we'd like to see both pain literacy improve, and as their pain literacy improves, their health behaviors change.
mm.
What have you learned from your experience, I guess, in those two areas from, your research as well as the Flipping Pain campaign?
Yeah, so pain literacy, pain related health literacy, whatever term you want to use, I think it's a major issue, and I think there's plenty of evidence to show that health literacy in itself is it has associations with outcomes in a variety of different conditions, and pain is no different. I think health literacy is such a broad, multifaceted term because it doesn't just talk about understanding of a topic, but it also talks about things like how do you then sort of analyze or process that information and use it subsequently in healthcare contacts, etc. I think that's something that we need to get better at when we're trying to facilitate pain-related health literacy.
So
I
I love the word you use there, and I just want to tag that for a minute. And the word you used was process.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we're bringing people through a process of change rather than a one-time educational intervention that we hope, and it does potentially happen in some people, but this change we're looking for is a process that typically happens over time.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're only certainly in the public health space, we're only seeing a person for tops 90 minutes in a session. Certainly within the Flip and Pain campaign, a lot of our sort of town hall events are 90 minutes long. So you've got a captive audience for that. But if what you're really hoping is that this is it's like a gateway that shows the consumer or the attendee a different way of looking at things. But they then have to go through that gate and begin to look at things in that way. And if they don't, well then it's gonna peter out. You're gonna have very little effect. But the reality is again about drip feeding messages. I think if we show that gateway and then maybe if they don't go through it, but a year down the line, they get another similar type message. Maybe at that point they'll get through the gate and they'll begin to process the information in a different way and look at it from a different perspective. So I think it's important with public health campaigns like this not to be too simplistic in terms of outcomes and always looking for huge change after each intervention. That's perfectly fine if looking for that within a clinical setting, if you wish, where you see people over multiple points and provide a rounded, sort of multidisciplinary, multifaceted intervention. If you're having 90 minutes of some guy talking about pain on a stage, followed by a panel of people talking about it, you're not looking for the same level of change. It's pointless to try and hope for that. You're looking to nudge people in the right direction, but many more people than one person at a time. But yeah, you're trying to get that, bring about that change in approach that will lead to long-standing change in how you view, which is easier said than done, for sure.
And then also when we talk about the public, for example, the United States of America, the UK, right? These are countries. But even within those countries, there are distinct groups that we may have to change our messaging around. I think it kind of brings us to the topic of health equity and helping, accessing people who may not have access to adequate education, knowledge, support. I'm wondering if what you learned about health equity and kind of the messaging for different groups from the flip and pain.
Yeah. So that's a really good point, and it sparks back to kind of where we started our discussion. This idea that, you know, I guess I used to work in the field of, and still do, that one-to-one clinical contact, and now it's more sort of talking to, you know, audiences in a more public health space, and how they are different, and they are different, but there's also some similarities between them. You're also still trying to take a person in the audience on a journey. And often those audiences are collections of groups within the community. So we'll often do things like we've done sessions on fibromyalgia specific. Now, I appreciate that there are important nuanced differences between different pain conditions. But I don't think it's also unfair to say that what makes us similar as persistent pain groups heavily outweighs those individual differences. So a lot of our messaging is still the same, even if we're talking to on the topic of phantom limb pain, if we're talking about fibromyalgia. Um, and it's, but to the consumer, it's everything, because it's, does this relate to me? Does this relate to me, which means I'll actually go to the event? And then does this relate to me in that, do I connect with what's being said? And does it actually help to kind of shift my thinking a little? So it's, you still have to get that connection. You still have to help the audience see the relevance of what you're saying, just like you would in a clinical contact. You just need to be, I guess, slightly more generalized. You can't be as specific, but if you can find uniters, uniting points that pretty much everyone with pain will go, oh yeah, that I can see how that relates to me. You can find those little beauties, you drop those in, and they help to people to make that connection of, that's relevant to me. Now appreciate I've gone off on a huge tangent, and I'm going to come back to health equality or inequalities, as you asked. So in the Flip and Pain campaign, we just looked at some data we've had over the past year. And we've been running the campaign in a place called the Tees Valley, which isn't too far from me. It's actually, my university is in the Teesside University is in the catchment area of the Tees Valley, and it's an area which has an industrialized area, so it will have its areas of and communities that are disadvantaged and seldom heard communities, and if you we've looked at our audiences from the perspective of their postcodes, and from that calculating their what it's called a sort of a multiple index of deprivation. I don't particularly like the term deprivation in terms of the context, but that's just what it's called. So I can't very much give it a different name. But in that index rates people's postcodes based on a 1 to 10, with 1 being a sort of the most disadvantaged, and 10 being the least disadvantaged or most affluent. And what we found is that we're about not a quarter, about 20% of our audiences are in that 1 and 2 decile category, so the most disadvantaged categories. And that's pretty encouraging, in that we are reaching these communities to an extent, but there are 2 sort of caveats there for me. One is, we know that disadvantaged communities are disproportionately affected in terms of prevalence and impact. So one might expect to see, in terms of need, more people from those communities than we're seeing at the moment. At the moment, we're seeing a relatively equal spread of people attending. The second thing then is, I think those postcode based metrics, although they are extremely useful, and for want of a better word, the gold standard here in the UK in terms of assessing level of disadvantage, I think they leave a lot to be desired as metrics. And something tells me, just on a hunch, anecdotally, from talking to the people who attend, that even though they may live in a postcode that would suggest they are from quite a disadvantaged background, when you chat to them, you actually get the sense that that's not quite the case. They are perhaps, for want of a better word, more middle class, more in those middle deciles, but they just happen to live in a postcode that suggests they're in a disadvantaged community. I'm still not sure that we're truly hitting and reaching the people who need it the most. And that's part of our. So we're writing a grant at the moment to try and explore, how do we reach out to these guys within a public health way to try and change understandings around pain. I think that's, if we're really wanting to make a difference on a public health level, we have to look at this through a health inequalities lens. I think if we deliver these campaigns and we predominantly get middle class people, I think the risk is we just widen the health inequalities gap, and that's something that we really don't want to do.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, as we start to wrap up, what are your next steps? And it sounds like you're taking some significant steps by looking for grant funding and research to reach people we may not be reaching. Even people kind of have this misconception that everyone has an internet connection and a cell phone in their hand where they're watching things, and that's not necessarily true.
No, absolutely. An important element of the Flip and Pain campaign is that it is a blended approach. We do lots of town hall events in person. Now, we record them, we put them on our YouTube videos, we put them on the website so people can go and see them, and there's plenty of online traffic. But the meat and drink of what we do is in person with people, and that's extremely important with disadvantaged communities, especially. So the area I've talked about that has a reading age of 8 years old. So it's so important to be there, I think, in present, so you can get added information from body language, from nuance. People can ask individual questions from the audience, just to and in terms of trust, I think people are far more trusting. One of the elements we do in the campaign is that when we do these town hall events, we, as often and as best we can, try to get on our panel people with lived experience from the locality. So people with lived experience are front and center of the campaign, because it for a million different reasons, but especially because it engenders trust. You want that consumer, that audience member, to trust and really believe what's being said, and you can relate to the person on the stage. That goes a long way too. It's a lived experience is front and center of what we do, but especially if it's local lived experience, I think that's even more valuable. Just picking up, as you said, Joe, as we wrap up in terms of the future of these sorts of campaigns, I think there's two things I'd like to talk about: reciprocity and evaluation. It's this idea that, and I suspect I've probably used even the wrong term, because that's the sort of guy I am of mixing up my terms. But it's reciprocal determinism. That's the term I wanted to use. It's about people who come to these events. them becoming agents for change themselves, them being the ones who become the people who start to seek out a change to the system, better healthcare systems, better social care systems, better laws, governing policies, etc., that will bring about a less painogenic society. And I think the more people we reach that way, that's an important thing to try and create. I think there'll be a sort of a tipping point if we can gain enough momentum, reach enough people, where the public then start demanding change.
Yeah.
They start to say, well, why are you allowing all this negative practice to happen? Why are you allowing all this non-evidence based stuff to happen? We want a more evidence based approach. I think if the public start to want that, then real change happens. That people power. That's on a practical level. That's something that would be amazing to see. I think we're a long way from it yet, but you have to start somewhere. The second point is a core part of that is evaluation. We don't know the extent of how what the impact of these public health campaigns are. We simply don't, and we won't know until we do really thorough, high quality evaluations. Only at that point will we know for certain whether this is indeed the right way to go. But to do that takes enormous effort and enormous funding. And it's not traditionally a place that gets a great deal of funding, pain within a public health space. But I hope that funders begin to see the value of it, of checking whether this is the right way forward. Because once we get the data, then if it is supportive, that will get more and more places on board, and that facilitates that sort of groundswell movement. Without the data, really hard to create.
Yeah, I mean, those are two excellent points. And I think, of course, we always welcome, because you're really talking about long-term epidemiological data based on these public health campaigns that they're running. We need that. And there
Yeah,
should be more money put toward that.
yeah.
The first point that you made, though, as I listen to you, I find to be potentially a more rapid and more hopeful way for us out of this. Because if individuals with pain or communities, entire communities can take this information and then start to spread it, like a wildfire, so to speak,
Mhm.
then we may see change happen even before we can even, collect the data to say, hey, this actually works. The public will tell us this works, thank you, and I'm going to now share this with my friends and family and
Yeah,
colleagues, and that's
yeah.
it's a nice pro-social way, I think, to end this conversation, right?
Absolutely. Wouldn't it be brilliant if, as a healthcare professional, when your patient came through the door, they said, "I've got this pain. It's been here for about a year. And do you know what I'd really like to do? I'd really like to try and get a bit more active. I think that's what I need to do. Or I'd really like to. I've got I'm really worried about it, and I know that worry isn't helping. I'd like to talk through that with you. Imagine if the conversation started that way. What a wonderful open door that would be
Yeah.
for good practice. And I think we can get there. I think we're just a long way from there just yet.
Yeah. Well, with your help and everyone else who's listening to this episode, we're definitely one step or a giant step closer. So I appreciate you being here, Cormac. Again, it's been great speaking with you about this topic of how we can bring pain science education to the public in a more health promoting way. Let our listeners know how they can learn more about you and follow the work that you're doing.
Okay, so I'm based at Teesside University, so you can find out about me on the website. I'm also co-lead of the PETAL collaboration, Pain Education Team to Advance Learning is what it stands for. We've got a website. It's a really neat group which looks at, and the publication that we talked about today about pain education for whole of communities. So that was a PETAL group collaboration, and I'd like to thank all the co-authors there. Some exceptional people writing on that paper, and it was a joy to pull it together. So you can check out the PETAL collaboration website as well. And then finally, I've got to plug the Flippin' Pain campaign and the Flippin' Pain campaign website. It's a really, really good resource. One of the most satisfying things is when we go and deliver these town hall sessions in various parts of the UK. The people come up and say, "Oh, certainly healthcare professionals say I always direct my patients to your materials and to your resources." That's a really, really nice thing to do, that they're being used. So you can check us out on www.flippinpain.co.uk. No G.
Excellent. Of course, all those links will be in the show notes at the Integrative Pain Science Institute. Cormac and I would like to thank you for joining us today to talk about pain science education in the public sphere. Of course, we ask you to share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues on whatever social media you're active on. You can find me on all platforms and just tag me at Dr. Joe Tatta. It's been a pleasure being with you this week, and we'll see you next week.